Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tira Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janna Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki. Jayam Vishnupad, Paramahansa Parivrajikacharya, Ashtottara Shatta Sri Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Sarasvati Thakur Goswami Maharaj Prabhupada ki. Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki. Jainita Gaur Premanandi. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd Canto, Chapter 28, entitled Kapila's Instructions on Devotional Service, Text 10. Mano chiratyad virajam Jita shwasasya yoginaha Vaivagnibhyam yataloham Dmatang tyajati vaimalam Manochiratyad virajam Jita Shwasasya Yoginaha Vavagnyabhyam Yata Loham Dhamatam Tyajati Vaimalam Manochiratsya Virajam Jita Shwasasya Yoginaha Vaivagnyam Yata Loham Dhamatam Tyajati Vaimalam Manochiratsya Virajam Vaishnavis. Word for word, please repeat. Mana, the mind. Achirat, soon. Syat, can be. Virajam, free from disturbances. Jita Shwasasya, whose breathing is controlled. Yogina, of the yogi. Vayu Agni Bhyam, by air and fire. Yata, just as. Loham, gold. Dhamatam, fanned. Tyajati, becomes freed from. Vai, certainly. Malam, impurity. Translation. The yogis who practice such breathing exercises are very soon freed from all mental disturbances, just as gold, when put into fire and fanned with air, becomes free from all impurities. So just to put this translation into context here, because this is my first time back at the temple in ages, so where are we in the Bhagavatam at the moment? This is the third canto, as was mentioned earlier, chapter 28, Kapila's instructions on devotional service. So this chapter, it's, you could say it's like an expanded, more detailed version of chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita. It talks about this process of pranayama. But the wonderful thing about this chapter in particular in the Bhagavatam is it really goes into detail on the meditation on the Lord's form. Chapter 6 in the Bhagavad Gita talks a lot about the breathing itself. This chapter does too, but this chapter goes even further and it really talks about what the super soul actually looks like, how to meditate on each of the limbs. So it's quite a nice chapter. So this particular text here, it's in the pranayama section, talking about how the breathing works. So I'll touch on the other two texts before and after this, after reading this translation and purport. So purport. This process of purifying the mind is also recommended by Lord Chaitanya. He says that one should chant Hare Krishna. He says further, Param Vijayate, all glories to Sri Krishna Sankirtan. All glories are given to the chanting of the holy names of Krishna, because as soon as one begins this process of chanting, the mind becomes purified. Cheto Darpana Marjanam. By chanting the holy name of Krishna, one is cleansed of the dirt that accumulates in the mind. One can purify the mind either by the breathing process or by the chanting process, just as one can purify gold by putting it in a fire and fanning it with a bellows. Srila Prabhupada ki. Ammajnana tamarandasya gananjana shalakaya chaksho ummalitam yena tasmai Shri Guruve namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Translation once again. The yogis who practice such breathing exercises are very soon freed from all mental disturbances. Just as gold, when put into fire and fanned with air, becomes free from all impurities. So I'll just read the previous text and the text after it as well. The yogi, so this is text 9. The yogi should clear the passage of vital air by breathing in the following manner. First, he should inhale very deeply, then hold the breath in, and finally exhale. Or, reversing the process, the yogi can first exhale, then hold the breath outside, and finally inhale. This is done so that the mind may become steady and free from external disturbances. And the text after it, text 11, is as follows. By practicing the process of pranayama, one can eradicate the contamination of his physiological condition. And by concentrating the mind, one can become free from all sinful activities. By restraining the senses, one can free himself from material association. And by meditating on the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one can become free from the three modes of material attachment. So, as often is the case in the Bhagavatam, with Srila Prabhupada's purports, the translation says something, and then you're thinking that, okay, so this is what I'm thinking about, this breathing, and then Prabhupada often can take the purport in a totally different direction. Sometimes he'll take it directly, sometimes he'll take a different tack. So in this particular purport, he, in one sense, is taking it head on, and in another sense, he's taking it in another way. He's taking it head on in the sense that we're talking about purification. So that's wanted, purifying the mind of all material contamination. But how to do it is different. So he says, one can purify the mind either by the breathing process or by the chanting process. And if anyone's read all of Srila Prabhupada's books, you'll never find him encouraging you to do the breathing process. He's always chant Hare Krishna. So all these texts and purports throughout the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 6 as well, it's all described, but ultimately, as the conclusion of chapter 6 is that the best yogi is the one who engages in devotional service, not the Ashtanga yogi, not the one who's meditating on the breath. But we do also hear in this very same canto of the Bhagavatam that it is possible to follow this process, and we just had that from Kapila Muni's father, Karma Muni. He practiced pranayama. But he did it in a completely proper, bona fide way. He didn't just try to do it to purify himself and get some mystic power. We do understand from reading from the pages of the third canto of the Bhagavatam that he did indeed attain mystic power. He created a huge aerial mansion and so on. But he was meditating on the supersoul while he was doing his pranayama breathing. He was using that purification and that focus for the right purpose. And not only was he meditating on the supersoul, but he also had the right mood. Because it's also explained that one can practice pranayama, meditate on the supersoul, but instead think of worshipping the supersoul, think that actually that's me. I and the supersoul are one. And this is the incorrect understanding. Of course, we understand that there is the supersoul in the heart, but there is also the jiva, side by side, like two birds in a tree, as the Upanishads explain. So what I wanted to focus on today was basically what Prabhupada's focusing on here, which is the process of purification, which is done by chanting Hare Krishna as recommended by Lord Chaitanya. And Srila Prabhupada's doing this because that's the recommended process for this age. So it's not, as he says in the purport, it's not that the breathing process doesn't work. One can purify the mind either by the breathing process or by the chanting process. It does indeed work. But for this age, it's a very rare person who can perform such a process. The Yuga Dharma for this age is chanting Hare Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada is mentioning this in the purport, that that's basically what we should do. So he mentions this in the previous text in the purport. He mentions that practicing the yoga system of exercise and breath control is very difficult for a person in this age. And therefore Lord Chaitanya recommended Kirtaniya Sada Hari. One should always chant the holy name of the Supreme Lord Krishna, because Krishna is the most suitable name of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The name Krishna and the Supreme Person Krishna are non-different. Therefore, if one concentrates his mind on hearing and chanting Hare Krishna, the same result is achieved. So if one's practicing pranayama and focusing on the supersoul, that's a focus on the Lord's form. But by chanting Hare Krishna, it's also focusing on the Lord in the form of his holy name. The Lord is absolute. His name, his form are non-different. So for this age, we're recommended to focus on the Lord's name. Not that we can't look at the deities, of course. They're very beautiful, and it's part of the process of devotional service to meditate on the Lord's form. But as it's explained, without Sankirtan, Yajna, without the chanting of the Lord's names, all the other things, they don't have the same punch that they did in previous ages. It's the Yuga Dharma is chanting Hare Krishna. We don't get initiated into just deity seva. We do that, but it is part of a bigger process. Whereas in Dwapara Yuga, that was the process to worship the deity. That was the main process. But in this age, we perform the other limbs of devotional service, but the main limb is chanting and hearing, in particular the Lord's holy names. So Prabhupada also mentions in the next purport the same thing. He mentions that ultimately one has to meditate on the Supreme Personality of Godhead in order to be elevated to the transcendental position, where he is no longer affected by the three modes of material nature. So this is how it's done. It's basically, this whole chapter, it's recommending a certain process for a certain time. This conversation happened in a previous age, and it was the correct process. But because we're in a different age, we can't strictly follow this process. Unless one's like Vyasadeva, who's still around on the planet somewhere, he could do it, but he probably won't, but he could. So if you were born in a previous age and you're still alive, then you've got the machinery, so to speak, to be able to do such a thing. So I'll just bring up what I wanted to discuss today. So as I mentioned earlier, it's similar to chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, talking about pranayama. An interesting point that Prabhupada mentions is that in addition to it being very difficult to do pranayama, unless we ultimately meditate properly on the Supreme Personality of Godhead with focus, then even your pranayama, even though it may purify you, it's not going to have any real results. So I'll give an example of this. So Kadama Muni, as I mentioned earlier, he performed pranayama correctly, and he saw the Lord, and he understood that this is not me, this is my worshipful Lord, and so he achieved the correct result. He got darshan of the Lord. The Lord said, what would you like? And he basically said, even the Lord said, I know what you want. I haven't read this section, so I'm a little bit rusty, but he basically understood his mind, and he basically sent him along his perfect partner that he was desiring in his heart. And then he had several children, one of them being Kapila Muni. So that's a pretty far out benediction, to get the Supreme Personality of Godhead as your child. So we can understand that Kadama Muni is not an ordinary person. But his example is what we want to take from this, is that he did pranayama, he meditated on the super soul in the mood of devotion. So that's perfect. Whereas someone else who did severe austerities, not to be imitated ever by anyone, as it's mentioned in the Bhagavatam, it's like this personality I'm about to mention did such austerities that no one can imitate them, was Hiranyakashipu. His process of breath control and restraint was so intense and powerful that even though he was fully dead, basically all his bones were left, but his flesh was all gone, eaten by ants, but he was still somehow or other, by his intense power of austerity and his practice of yogic breath control, he managed to maintain his life force still within his bones. So he was still alive. And when Lord Brahma saw him like this, he was like, this is far out. And Brahma's probably thinking, I couldn't do such a thing. Who is this guy? So Brahma was very impressed, and he gave him benedictions. But the point of this example is that even though Hiranyakashipu got his benedictions, because he wasn't performing his pranayama in a mood of devotion, he wasn't focusing on the super soul and thinking, this is my worshipful Lord. Doesn't even mention that he was focusing on the super soul in the few texts that I read. But he just wanted the mystic power that comes from performing such austerities. And because of this, he got two results, which ultimately we don't want. The first result was that he was never satisfied. This is an interesting point. He ruled the whole universe, he had all mystic powers, but he was never satisfied. So this is a very strong point that the Bhagavatam makes, is that you cannot be materially happy ever. You get to the topmost position, you've got all the mystic power, you can enjoy any which way you like, but still you're not satisfied. So this is the first problem of performing such pranayama in the incorrect fashion. And the second point is that he still died just like everyone else. He still died, left his body, but he didn't go back to Godhead. He took another birth, and that's what happens in this material world. If you're not in full devotional consciousness at the time of death, then you take another birth. So these are the two results of incorrectly performed pranayama. So our process is Chaitudarpanamarjanam, Sri Krishna Sankirtanam. So we can understand that this works. We don't just have to take Prabhupada's word for it, although that's very good. If we can just take Prabhupada's word for everything, then we'll immediately go back to Godhead, because he's a pure devotee and what he says is perfect. But by practical experience, we can understand that chanting Hare Krishna purifies the mind. After a festival, when there's been hours and hours of kirtan, or you might have chanted 16 attentive rounds like that, and then you realize that, wow, there's just like some clarity, there's no noise, there's just peace. And many devotees, of course, also get this experience by preaching, by helping others become Krishna conscious. Krishna naturally purifies one's own mind and they get clarity. But sometimes when we're chanting Hare Krishna, we may have doubts. We may be chanting 16 rounds, and then after we've chanted our 16 rounds, we're thinking, I've still got some disturbances up here. Is this working? So there's problems with that, of course, as we understand there's 10 offences to the holy name. Somehow or other there's offences in the chanting. But an interesting point to meditate on is that it is a gradual process, this process of devotional service, and it can be compared to this process of pranayama. Because in previous ages, for example, Kadama Muni, he performed his process of pranayama, meditating on the Lord's form, for 10,000 years. So that's a really long time. And what's more, someone like Vishwamitra Muni, he was doing it for up to 60,000 years. So it wasn't unusual for people to spend, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years to obtain the desired result. So similarly, for us, we have a much reduced time, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's not so much in comparison to 60,000 years. So we've got a very easy process. But the important thing to note is that the same result can be achieved. I can't remember the exact quote. Bhakti Vikash Swami quoted Prabhupada, and this was in relation to performing pranayama. He said something to the equivalent of, if you just go out for one day and try to give Krishna to others, you just do that one day, that's the equivalent of spending like hundreds of years performing pranayama. Something like that. So the point Prabhupada was making is that our process works. It's the express process, and it's designed for this age when we have very short lifespans. So as I mentioned earlier, the conclusion of chapter 6 of Bhagavad Gita is that the devotee is the topmost yogi, not the one who's performing severe austerities, breath control like that. It works, but Krishna prefers devotion. He also mentions this to Uddhava in the 11th canto. He mentions so many different things like charity, austerities, digging wells, so many different philanthropic activities. They're nice. Krishna admits, they're good, but they're not as pleasing to me as devotional service. So similarly, Krishna's making this point in the Bhagavad Gita at the end. The karmi, the jnani, the yogi, topmost is the bhakti yogi. That's the platform that we want to aim for. So, as I was mentioning earlier, the main theme I wanted to focus on was this point of purification. So, in Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, text 30, there's a really nice section describing purification. So the first point is that we have to, as far as possible, prevent contamination. As we understand, Ayurveda works a lot on this. It's like modern medicine is about hacking and slashing and fixing up your broken condition, whereas Ayurveda's, generally speaking, it does fix things, but it tries to go more for the other direction, like just don't get sick in the first place. Understand what your dosha is, what your flaws are in your body, and eat accordingly, live accordingly like that, so you don't have any issues. Whereas Western medicine's like, oh, you got this problem, take this pill. You might get these side effects, but that's all right. So ideally, first we prevent issues. So it mentions here, as far as possible, a devotee is very cautious so that he does not do anything that could disrupt his wholesome condition. So in other words, we can also compare this to chanting Hare Krishna. There's 10 offences, so as far as possible we try to avoid the offences. We don't do anything that could lead to any issues. So it mentions here, he knows that perfection in his activities depends on his progressive realization of Krishna consciousness. But sometimes, however, it may be seen that a person in Krishna consciousness commits some act which may be taken as most abominable socially or politically. But such a temporary fall down does not disqualify him. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated that if a person falls down but is wholeheartedly engaged in the transcendental service of the Supreme Lord, the Lord, being situated within his heart, purifies him and excuses him from that abomination. So the point here is that we don't have to do anything else. We just perform bhakti and that solves everything. Even if we make a mistake, We don't have to do anything extraneous to fix ourselves up. We just need to, for us, it's very simple. It's our vows that we make at the time of initiation is chanting 16 rounds and following the 4 regulative principles. So if there's been some issue, then it's not a question of doing some prayaschita, some atonement. It's rather getting back on the train, so to speak, and following the 4 regulative principles and chanting your 16 rounds and doing devotional service. We don't go outside of that. That is the purification process, and it is ultimately what we're doing in perfection as well. We chant Hare Krishna here so we can glorify the Lord in the spiritual world. So in one sense, we're already doing now what we'll be doing once we're out of here. So the 11th canto verse referred to above is from chapter 5, text 42. I'll just read out the translation. One who has thus given up all other engagements and has taken full shelter at the lotus feet of Hari, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, is very dear to the Lord. Indeed, if such a surrendered soul accidentally commits some sinful activity, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is seated within everyone's heart, immediately takes away the reaction to such sin. So the key word to note here in both the purport that Prabhupada wrote in the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita and in the 11th canto by his disciples is this word accidentally. It has to be an accident. We can't consciously commit a sinful activity. As we understand, this is an offense against the holy name of the Lord. If I remember correctly, it's number 7, to commit sinful activities on the strength of chanting Hare Krishna. So it has to be an accident. Otherwise, it's like, as Prabhupada would often say about certain people who commit sins all through the week and on Sunday go somewhere to say, I'm sorry, please forgive me, and then after Sunday's over, they go back to their sinful activities. That's not good. This means that you don't really care. You're just using someone as a scapegoat. You're basically saying, hey, you take all my sins, I'll go make some more sins, you take some more, and I'll go to sin some more, and you keep taking them. You just keep suffering for me so I can enjoy it. It's a hellish mentality. We should basically desire to become free from all sinful activity. Of course, while we're still in the recovering stage of bhakti, while we're still trying to get well, so to speak, there may be some slips. But as long as we're sincere and determined and focused, then it's explained that the Lord will excuse such offenses. And so there's another extension to this I'd like to read from text 31 of chapter 9 of Bhagavad Gita, which is on the same point. So Prabhupada says, generally a devotee who is engaged in the 9 kinds of devotional activities is engaged in the process of cleansing all material contamination from the heart. He puts the Supreme Personality of Godhead within his heart, and all sinful contaminations are naturally washed away. Continuous thinking of the Supreme Lord makes him pure by nature. According to the Vedas, there is a certain regulation that if one falls down from his exalted position, he has to undergo certain ritualistic processes to purify himself. So that's standard Vedic regulations. You do something wrong, then you have to atone for it. You have to perform some pious activity. But Prabhupada says here, but here there is no such condition, because the purifying process is already there in the heart of the devotee, due to his remembering the Supreme Personality of Godhead constantly. Therefore, the chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, should be continued without stoppage. So you should keep going. This will protect the devotee from all accidental fall downs. He will thus remain perpetually free from all material contaminations. So we don't need anything else. This is, you could say, a large anartha in the process of bhakti yoga that needs to be removed. There's always this thought that, yes, bhakti yoga works, but I still need this or that, or whatever it is. We need something on the side until I'm fully pure, until I'm fully surrendered. But at the same time, that can stop us from fully surrendering. We're still attached to something. And I heard Urmila Mataji mentioning this, I think, during the lockdown. We're still in the lockdown, but level 4 maybe. She mentioned in one class that was broadcast for this temple, she mentioned how emotional fulfillment was a good example. We may do all the externals of bhakti, but we may put our heart somewhere else. So, and of course, that's okay. Until we fully have given our heart to Krishna, naturally it's going to be invested in other things. But the point that she was trying to make is that we should basically just be honest with ourselves where we're really at and where we're placing our heart, and just understand that, okay, I'm putting a certain amount of my heart energies into this, into that, into that, and this much into bhakti. So we gradually want to just take it away from those other things and put more of it into Krishna, into devotional service, and we'll become more and more satisfied. As Vaisheshekha Prabhu said, where attention goes, energy flows. So if while you're chanting your 16 rounds, you're thinking of something else, that's where you're putting your energy. It's the heart, as Prabhupada mentions in the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 2. It's the source of all energies, and he says that even modern medical scientists admit this fact. So the point we're wanting to make here is that that's got energy, our heart has energy, so where are we putting that heart energy? So ultimately we want to invest it all in Krishna and not anywhere else. So an interesting point about falling down, having an issue and being reinstated in devotional service, I don't think we'll see this example that I'm about to mention anytime soon in our current ISKCON society, because it's a different ISKCON than in Prabhupada's day, because in Prabhupada's time it was he was getting things going. It was full emergency. Now we're in like secondary level emergency mode, you could say. It's still don't have Varnashram Dharma running, we don't have so many things, but we've got a lot more steadiness. For example, Shivaram Swami said, like in the last 20 years or something, we've only had one sannyasi fall down or something like that out of 70 sannyasis, something like that. Whereas in Prabhupada's time, sannyasis were falling down quite regularly, so it's a different time. So anyway, I just want to share this example to illustrate a point. So there was a particular devotee. I don't know if he was a sannyasi. I'm pretty sure he wasn't, because he was GBC, and usually those who took sannyas were in GBC roles in Prabhupada's time. Now it's a bit different. Like most of GBC, you see is like heaps of sannyasis. Maybe it's 50-50, I'm not sure. But so this particular devotee, Karandara, I think he was GBC. He was in some high position anyway, in maybe America and in LA, and he was doing all sorts of management. He was quite an important person. He was really helping things move on for the Krishna consciousness movement. But at some point he fell into difficulty. I don't know what his issue was. Generally speaking, most people have problem with one regulative principle. The other three aren't so difficult. It's more one particular regulative principle that's more difficult to follow. So from my understanding, there may have been some issue there, and anyway, he went away, but he came back, and he apologized to Prabhupada, and he wanted to take up devotional service again. Now, this is a very interesting thing. So what had just happened is that Tamal Krishna Goswami was GBC of India, and he was like really pressing Prabhupada to give him sannyas. And eventually, there's a nice story behind this, but eventually he did take sannyas. Prabhupada finally gave him sannyas, as Tamal Krishna Goswami desired. But this caused an issue, and this was one of the points Prabhupada was saying, no, I don't want to give it to you, because Prabhupada needed a GBC in India. Of course, Prabhupada was doing so much work himself in India, but as we know, Prabhupada obviously had to travel around the world and maintain the movement. So when he gave Tamal Krishna Goswami sannyas, he no longer had a GBC man or someone who could really manage things in India, because most of his American disciples found it very difficult with the Indians. They were expert at cheating them, so Prabhupada was really concerned. And then this devotee Karandara came back. And so Prabhupada, he immediately put him in a very high position. He made him GBC of India. And Karandara was like, no, what are you doing? I want to start my devotional service again. GBC of India, hang on, just maybe something a bit smaller or something. And Prabhupada said, no. You can do it. I think you can do it, So the point I'm trying to make here is that pure devotees, Krishna, they may not see our faults and our flaws and the mistakes that we've made, and they'll immediately just put us back up in a high position again. Yes, you're a devotee, you can do so much for Krishna, go for it. So Prabhupada did that, but as we understand, as I was explaining, Srila Prabhupada understood it was an emergency situation. Someone of Karandara's caliber to do the particular service that he was doing wasn't the most common person. So because he was there, he engaged him in Krishna's service in that way. So the point that I'm trying to clearly make here is that even if we fall down, if we come back and just re-engage in devotional service, then there is no loss. Krishna says this in the Bhagavad Gita as well. Even if one strays away from the path of devotional service, there's no loss. Of course, we don't want to fall down. It's a horrible thing to think of falling down and going back into material energy. You just need to go out and meet a few people who are engaged in materialistic activities, or for myself, a really simple way I can get experience of the miseries of material life is I just call my parents. Seriously, every time I call it, there's always some disaster or some problem. It's just like, wow, this is what I'm missing out on. Great. And not that devotees don't have problems, of course. It's the material world. It's a place full of suffering, but we get more support to deal with the suffering. And ultimately, once one reaches the highest platform, one no longer experiences that suffering, even though it's there. As Aravinda Nab was quoting in a class he gave recently in the ashram from Bhagavad Gita chapter 2, text 70, that one who's full in themselves, like the ocean, they're not disturbed by material desires that come and go. Like the ocean's not disturbed by the rivers that come in and go away. They're just full of themselves. So one who's on the highest platform of devotional service, all these material problems, desires, so many things come and go, but it's not such a big issue. But of course, that's the ultimate goal. We want to come to that platform like Srila Prabhupada showed. He had so many problems. Just because he was a pure devotee, it's not that he didn't have problems. He had so many issues, so many things he had to deal with. But he just was unstoppable. So Krishna conscious, so determined. Nothing could stop him. I mean, he opened up 108 centers around the world. He traveled around the world 12 times. He was 69 when he started the Krishna consciousness movement in New York. So if one's got their heart in the right place, then Krishna can empower them and they can do the impossible. So that's what we see from the example of Srila Prabhupada. And similarly, he used that impossible determination, the intense empowerment he got, to empower all sorts of people, like Karandara, who fell down and came back. Immediately Prabhupada empowered him. Okay, here you go, big position, go for it. So Prabhupada achieved amazing things in such a short time. But he also said that at a certain point of his movement, he said, now it's time to boil the milk. So he wanted us to not fall down, wanted us to become more serious, more condensed in our devotional service. So in terms of understanding Krishna, it's done through devotional service, chanting Hare Krishna, as we're hearing about in the purport today. This is the process of purification. We can't do it through Gyan. So I met this boy in Papakura a few days ago, and he seemed like a very nice boy, and he is, of course. But I thought he was a bit more sincere than I found out he was. As the conversation continued, I could understand that he was trying to understand God through Gyan. He didn't really want bhakti at this point. So at a certain point in the conversation, I exited, I left, because it was basically all about, I want to understand God here. But I would give him the answers, but because it's all here and this doesn't want to hear, it couldn't penetrate. So even though you give all the classic, simple, easy to understand answers, just not allowed, entrance not allowed to. So of course someone who's more empowered could have penetrated his jnanic shield, but I couldn't quite do that. So why can this be an issue? Why would this happen? So we need arika to understand God. It's not a matter of intellectual prowess. We can't try to wrestle Krishna to the ground with our intellect. And if we read the pages of the Bhagavatam, we understand that intellect is very tiny. Not only are we born in Kali Yuga, which is the lowest age, but then you hear of someone like Brahma and his intellectual prowess, and how he mentions in the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam, even with his most powerful intellect in the universe, he admits, I can't understand Krishna. Someone else may say they can do it, but I'm basically saying I can't do it. So, and this is also, he's the head of our parampara. So if the head of our parampara, Brahma, is saying, I can't figure Krishna out up here, then it's, he's setting a very good example for us and for everyone. So we can't understand Krishna through jnana. As Krishna explains in the Bhagavad Gita, Bhakti mam abhijanati. Only by devotional service can I be known. So we need some purification, we need some qualification to understand God. So we may even ask the right questions, but as Damodara Krishna often likes to point out, that if someone's not qualified for the answer, even though you give it to them, they can't appreciate it. It's a very interesting point to meditate on. Like, for example, if I give you the answer 5, and that number 5 that I just gave you is the answer to a super complex mathematical equation, how can we fully appreciate the answer if we don't understand the equation that it's coming from? That could be like so crucial for like a building not falling down, and it's just the number 5. What's it in relation to? So unless we have some qualification, some understanding, then we may not even appreciate the answer even if we get it. Like, Krishna is non-different from his holy name. You can say that to anyone, but if one doesn't have faith, then that's like falling on deaf ears, as they say. It's just like going in one ear, out the other. But the point that I want to stress here is intelligence. So how do we purify this intelligence? We can do it through various ways. Of course, chanting Hare Krishna is the main process. But also, I was reading chapter 3 of the Bhagavad Gita recently, and one of the texts says, the devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is offered first for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment verily eat only sin. So if one's constantly eating sin, then that equals sinful intelligence, basically. You are what you eat, as they say. So in the purport to text 11 of chapter 3 of Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada mentions how this works. He says, by performance of yagyas, all activities become purified, as it is stated in the Vedas. And there's some Sanskrit here which I'll skip. By performance of yagya, one's eatables become sanctified. And by eating sanctified foodstuffs, one's very existence becomes purified. By the purification of existence, finer tissues in the memory become sanctified, and when memory is sanctified, one can think of the path of liberation, and all these combined together lead to Krishna consciousness, the great necessity of present-day society. So even our activity of eating is a purification process. The whole bhakti process is about purification. So if someone's not engaging in any form of purification whatsoever, then it makes sense that it's going to be very difficult for them to understand and appreciate Krishna. So a question we can ask for ourselves, that I was thinking is, after I met this boy, was like, well, could I be doing the same thing? Am I trying to understand Krishna through jnana rather than by bhakti? Our mere explanations can't explain God. We need to be purified to understand. There's another very nice example in this regard. I think it was maybe 2 years ago that I heard this particular interview with Prabhupada by a reporter. And as far as I can tell, this reporter was maybe older, not older than Prabhupada, of course, but maybe he was in his 40s or 50s just by the sound of his voice. So the most interesting thing about this particular interview is that Prabhupada was making such a simple, basic point. It was so easy to understand. And as I was listening, I was like, yeah, that's the basics. But this guy just could not get it. and Prabhupada went over this. We know how Prabhupada can be sometimes, just like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, wording it differently, the same point again and again. And Prabhupada was saying to this gentleman, just try to understand the car, the driver. So he was giving the example of we're not the body, just ABCs of Krishna consciousness. And he gave the example of the car and the driver, and how the driver is different from the car. So we all understand this simple analogy, that the driver is compared to the soul, and the car is compared to the body. This guy could just not get it. Prabhupada explained it so many times in different ways, and he just wasn't qualified. Even with the purest of pure devotees right next to him, he just wasn't allowed to understand. So we need some purification to understand. We have to surrender to Krishna in some way, shape, or form. And we can have the purest of pure devotees right in front of us, but if we're not willing to surrender, then we can't understand. So we have to ourselves desire purification, desire to become qualified to understand Krishna. But after speaking with this boy that I was talking about earlier, who was trying to understand God through Gyan, I got the realization that I should have just been a bit nicer to him rather than trying to give him the answers. And I was, of course. I did make friends with him, and he appreciated the conversation, and it ended nicely. But I realized more that, if I could have just given him some prasadam, probably would have made a better impression rather than giving him all these answers he couldn't appreciate. Or, of course, if my character was more pure, then I could have penetrated. So character is actually our real preaching. Yad yada charati shreshtas. That's what the great leaders do. They don't preach so much by their words. They preach by their example, by their actions. Actions speak louder than words. And there was also a quote, I'm trying to remember this. I think it was a Franciscan monk. And I can't remember who the senior was, this certain particular senior. He said to this Franciscan monk, he said, okay, you go out and preach. And if you need to, say something. So the point is that just by you going out and being an example, that will be your preaching, rather than so much what your words say. Of course, it is said in the Bhagavad Gita that the most important quality of any man is his speech. That's how we can judge someone. But if we say one thing, we do another, then that's called a hypocrite. And that's age of Kali, full of hypocrisy. Everyone's sick of hypocrisy. They want some real truth, some real answers. So people appreciate godly qualities like honesty and compassion. So if we actually just imbibe such qualities in our life, that will be the real preaching. We don't need so much. It's not a jnanic approach that we're bringing to devotional service, although we may bring that in because of our past conditioning. We may think, I need to understand Krishna with my intellect, or by my prowess of doing stuff and getting stuff done, achieving things, I'll understand Krishna. No, it's actually both. In one sense, it's neither either or, and at the same time it's both. Bhakti is both the head and the heart. So we do things for Krishna, and we understand why we're doing it. As Prabhupada mentions in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, religion without philosophy is sentimental, and sometimes it can be fanatical. But on the flip side, if we have philosophy without religion, then it's just mental speculation. So bhakti is both. We use our head and our heart. We invest our heart and we understand why we're doing it. So we understand today from this purport that we should put our heart into chanting Hare Krishna. Why? Because this is the process of purifying the mind that's recommended by Lord Chaitanya. He says that one should chant Hare Krishna. So we understand why we're doing what we're doing, rather than just blindly following. Oh yes, so furthering this point of purification and how bhakti is all that's needed, there's a very nice example in the 6th canto. So in the 6th canto, atonement is discussed. And it begins with this question from Parikshit Maharaj. He says to his guru, he says to Shukadeva Goswami, "O greatly fortunate and opulent Shukadeva Goswami, now kindly tell me how human beings may be saved from having to enter hellish conditions in which they suffer terrible pains." So a bit of background to this is just before Parikshit Maharaj asked this question, he just heard his Gurudev explain all the hellish planets and all the places that you go for committing sinful activities. So Parikshit Maharaj is a compassionate devotee, naturally doesn't want anyone to go there. So he was asking Shukadeva Goswami this question, tell me how people can be saved from all these horrible places you just told me about. I don't want anyone to go there. And so Shukadeva Goswami replied, "My dear king, if before one's next death, whatever impious acts one has performed in this life with his mind, words and body are not counteracted through proper atonement, according to the description of the Manu Samhita and other Dharma Shastras, one will certainly enter the hellish planets after death and undergo terrible suffering, as I have previously described to you." So it's a trick answer. And of course, when we're first reading through Bhagavatam, we may not understand this. That he's saying to Parikshit Maharaj, of course, if someone does sinful activities, they should atone for them to get free from the sin-free action. So Shukadeva Goswami goes on to say, "Therefore, before one's next death comes, as long as one's body is strong enough, one should quickly adopt the process of atonement according to Shastra, otherwise one time will be lost and the reactions of his sins will increase. As an expert physician diagnoses and treats a disease according to its gravity, one should undergo atonement according to the severity of one's sins." So this answer that Shukadeva Goswami gives is actually just a test for Parikshit Maharaj. We're going back to that earlier point that we don't follow the Vedas in the sense that, like this, you do something sinful, so therefore there's a equivalent pious activity that you have to perform to deal with that. No, we just follow bhakti. That's the simple process for the sage. So Maharaj Parikshit knows this. And so he says, one may know that sinful activity is injurious for him because he actually sees that a criminal is punished by the government and rebuked by people in general. And because he hears from scriptures and learned scholars that one who is thrown into hellish conditions in the next life for committing sinful acts. He hears from scriptures and learned scholars that one is thrown into hellish conditions in the next life for committing sinful acts. So we know this. You do something bad, you get a reaction. We see this, you go to a shop and you steal something. You drive someone off the road in your car. You get a reaction, the police come after you. But here Parikshit Maharaj says, nevertheless, in spite of such knowledge, one is forced to commit sins again and again, even after performing acts of atonement. So we understand so many people go to jail, and then they come out of jail and they just commit sinful activities again. Therefore, what is the value of such atonement? So Parikshit Maharaj is very sharp. He understands that this doesn't work. So if we do something sinful and then we go next door and we mow our neighbour's lawns and think that will atone for that bad thing that I did today, maybe not. Maybe it will mitigate the immediate reaction that you might have got from smashing your neighbour's letterbox by accident, so then you mow your lawns to say sorry. But that desire, the sinful desires, are still within the heart, and they'll fructify at some later point. So those have to be dealt with. So this is what Parikshit Maharaj is getting at. He says further, sometimes one who is very alert so as not to commit sinful acts is victimized by sinful life again. I therefore consider this process of repeated sinning and atoning to be useless. It is like the bathing of an elephant, for an elephant cleanses itself by taking a full bath, but then throws dust over its head and body as soon as it returns to the land. So in other words, if you jump in the shower and you get nice and clean, and then as soon as you get out of the shower you just jump in some mud, what was the point? So Shukadev Goswami, he gives the real answer. He says, only a rare person who has adopted complete unalloyed devotional service to Krishna can uproot the weeds of sinful actions with no possibility that they will revive. He can do this simply by discharging devotional service, just as the sun can immediately dissipate fog by its rays. And then he says further, my dear king, if a sinful person engages in the service of a bona fide devotee of the Lord, and thus learns how to dedicate his life unto the lotus feet of Krishna, he can be completely purified. One cannot be purified merely by undergoing austerity, penance, brahmacharya, and the other methods of atonement I have previously described. So like pranayam, it can be another method of cleansing, but unless the sinful desire seeds within the heart are dealt with, like in the case of Hiranyakashipu, then we'll use that mystic power again to just commit more sinful activities. So this then leads Shukadev Goswami to launch into the story of Ajamil and illustrating practically how devotional service works. So at the end of this same chapter in the Bhagavatam, at the end of the first chapter of Canto 6 in the Bhagavatam, the Yamadutas turn up at the time of Ajamil's death, and they're basically going to take him to hell because he's performed so many sinful activities. And they say when the Vishnu Dutas turn up because he chants Narayan at the time of death, the Vishnu Dutas turn up because he chanted Narayan, and then the Yamadutas are like, what's going on here? What are you guys doing? And then the Vishnu Dutas say, what's the problem? This is our man, he chanted Narayan. You can't touch him. And the Yamadutas are like totally bewildered. They're like, hang on, this man Ajamil did not undergo atonement. Therefore, because of his sinful life, we must take him into the presence of Yamaraj for punishment. There, according to the extent of his sinful acts, he will be punished and thus purified. So that's how they were seeing it. So they didn't know about bhakti. They just were understanding ordinary dharma. And ordinary dharma is you do bad, then you have to do an equal good to atone for it. And if you don't, then you undergo punishment. And that will be your purification. But the Vishnu Dutas, they then actually say to the Yamadutas, they say that Ajamil has already atoned for all his sinful actions. Indeed, he has atoned not only for sins performed in one life, but for those performed in millions of lives. For in a helpless condition, he chanted the holy name of Narayan. Even though he did not chant purely, he chanted without offense. And therefore he is now pure and eligible for liberation. So this is a really nice verse to meditate on. So he chanted in a helpless condition. So we may not think that we're in a helpless condition when we're chanting Hare Krishna. So obviously we won't get the same result that Jamil did here. But if we really understand how horrible the material world is, and we get convinced of that through the eyes of the Shastra, the intelligence gets purified and we understand what a horrible place this actually is, instead of thinking, oh, it's actually not that bad, the material world. I'm doing all right. I've got a heater in my room, I'm warm. I've got some nice food in the oven. I've got a nice family, etc., then I'm not suffering. I'm doing all right. So it's very difficult to chant Hare Krishna with sincere determination, with this mentality of I'm actually in a helpless condition. Because if we do chant in such a way, that's offenseless chanting that makes us pure and eligible for liberation. So ultimately, purification is chanting Hare Krishna, and we just need to be fully convinced that that is the method of purification. Then we can invest our heart into it and get the real result. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening. Is there anyone with any questions, comments? Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki, Janita Gaur Premanandi.